protests on March 10th, the Tibetan National Uprising. And eventually I got the opportunity to serve and to work at university. I had a chapter of Students for Free Tibet, and I had the opportunity to come to New York and to work for 10 years with Students for Free Tibet and to get training and empowerment and the grassroots experience of doing the work in the trenches of the movement to try to shine the light inside Tibet, to try to support all of the initiatives and all of the leadership of His Holiness to provide some protection or some support for Tibetans inside who were carrying out the freedom struggle in the darkest and most difficult times. And the Olympics campaign was, I think, a major turning point for many of us, but also just a moment where we realized we could insert Tibet and human rights into the story that China did not want to happen at that moment, and to make sure that Tibet was not forgotten, and that China's narrative on Tibet, that Tibetans were happy and prospering under Chinese rule, that would not succeed.
Thank you. I would like to also thank National Endowment for the Repression and organizers and
Can't hear you.
Thank you, National Endowment for Democracy and President Carl Gresham organized this wonderful event. And also I thank Ambassador Brownback. He really supports Uyghur cause since many years, particularly since after the concentration camp issue internationally. So World Uyghur Congress is umbrella organization and the united voice of the Uyghur people in exile. And this is the umbrella and the representative organization. It was formed 2004 in Germany, based in Munich, in Germany. World Uyghur Congress, we are mostly working, advocating the Uyghur right to the international, particularly United Nations Human Rights Council, European institution, European Parliament, and the national government, national parliament, and also closely cooperate with international human rights organization as well. As you know, and just since the recently years, Uyghur cause was not well-known cause. Most of some people didn't know the Uyghurs. Tibet cause is very famous, everyone knows, but Uyghur cause was the very less known cause. So that's why World Uyghur Congress, we are trying to bring the Uyghur issue to the internationally and takes international attention, because Uyghur problem is a Tibetan problem, is completely same problem. But there are several reasons Uyghur issue is not well known. So that's why World Uyghur Congress want to take this mission and bring this cause internationally. We have a lot of job and advocacy work around the world. Yeah, and I personally Ryan already introduced to me. I was born in Turkestan and I escaped my country in 1994. Since 25 years, I'm living in exile. Since then, I have never been to my hometown. Since then, I have never seen my parents, brothers and sisters, my friends. Since 1997, Chinese government put my name in Interpol Red Notes. I was suffering 21 years as a terrorist and the Red Notes by the Interpol. But I have never disappointed with this. I have continued fighting for my right, and I got a lot of international support. Finally, 2018, last year, my Red Notes was deleted. No, my name not anymore in the Interpol Red Notes. Yeah. So, and one thing I would like to mention, I would like to take your attention. Today is last day of the Holy Ramadan. More than 1.5 billion Muslim people peacefully fasting all the 1 month, but exception Uyghurs, Kazakh in East Turkestan. And the whole Holy Ramadan month, Chinese government forbidden fasting. Ambassador Brownback already mentioned, even you cannot give the name Muhammad Aisha Samet such a name to your baby today. No any religious freedom. So this year, particularly 2019 Ramadan month, very critical, very miserable month for Uyghur people. And tomorrow is Ramadan Bayram, Ramadan festival. More than 1.5 billion Muslims celebrate this Ramadan festival, but Uyghur is exception. We cannot celebrate it, and there is a lot of, I see a lot of my countrymen, they want to call parents, friends, and family members to say hello and celebrate the Ramadan festival. My personally too, I wanted to call my parents, 90 years old father. My mother already died in the camp, but if he's still alive, I have no idea. I want to celebrate his festival, my brother sister festival, but I cannot. It's very unique. The whole Uyghur community living in Europe, United States, around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to turn the conversation a little bit towards the question of identity. So there's a lot of discussion and knowledge about political repression, surveillance, all of the different tools that the Chinese state uses to control the population, the entire population. But your three communities have distinct challenges and threats they face. And the way I understand it, core to it is the broad concept of identity, whether it's religious identity, the language you speak, the religious practices, core tenets of what makes your communities, your broader communities, or in the case of the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, your very sort of specific communities is the idea of identity. So I'd be curious if each of you can talk a little bit about what it means to your community, the level of repression, the scaling of the repression in the case of, as you noted, Xinjiang, which I think the statistics are actually over 3 million people out of a population between 10 and 20 million people who are facing direct threats. Can you talk a little bit about identity and how that motivates your work?
Sure. I'll say today is estimated 3 million Uyghurs in 21st century contemporary China just suffering. Some say 2 million and some rest also. But we don't know exact number. Maybe some say more than 3 million. So today, Chinese government is really start and ethnic cleansing policy towards the Uyghur. Today, Uyghur identity is at risk. And the Chinese government's one policy has never changed. It is assimilation policy towards the Uyghur and the Tibetan. Chinese government implemented this policy, sometimes used very violent way, sometimes with some mask. Particularly Xi Jinping talks of power 2013, we have witnessed and really start to very clearly even ignored all international warning, just very clearly implemented ethnic cleansing policy today in this Turkestan. You know, and I can say some examples. Language, religious, and the cultural is most important factor of the one identity. And Islam and Uyghur language and Uyghur culture is the most important factor of Uyghur identity. Today, Chinese government continually targeting this Uyghur language. When I was studying Xinjiang University, Uyghur language is I learned the Uyghur language. But start 2004, Chinese government so-called bilingual education system. Actually, it is Mandarin education system. Stopped Uyghur language at school. But step by step, from 2006, then from kindergarten to the university, all the Chinese language education system. Then 2017, Chinese government made official announcement saying just throughout bilingual education system, so Chinese language, Mandarin education system. Today, Uyghur students, school children cannot speak each other during the break time at school. And religious, it is one of the important factors of Uyghur identity. We already talked a little bit. And since 2016, 2017, within 1 year, more than 3,000 to 5,000 Uyghur mosques in Turkestan destroyed completely. Today you cannot go to the mosque, you cannot pray. And so many mosques destroyed, so many mosques already banned. All the mosques is empty. And the country, just I give you some example. Kashgar is one of the ancient city of the Silk Road. More than 2,000 years history. 2008-2009, Chinese government started so-called new host reform policy and it destroyed whole cultural heritage. More than 75-80% cultural heritage contribute destroyed. Then 2017, World Uyghur Congress led campaign to save the Kashgar cultural heritage. Then European Parliament in 2012 passed urgent resolution asks Chinese government stop destroy the Kashgar cultural heritage. But that time is already 75-80% all the cultural heritage is destroyed. So today Chinese government really implemented and cultural eradicated all the Uyghur identity.
Yeah, so it's clear the Chinese government is hell-bent on destroying, eliminating Tibetan identity, because this distinct identity is a threat to the Chinese state. They see it as a threat. That Tibetan cultural, religious, linguistic, national existence, really, they will not have the loyalty, they do not have the loyalty of the Tibetan people. The loyalty of the Tibetan people is first and foremost to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and to Buddhism or to their faith. And this was made clear in 2008 when Tibetans all across all the 3 historical provinces of Tibet rose up in March 2008, at the moment the Chinese government least wanted any sign of instability or dissent, in protest against Chinese rule and against these practices that are crushing Tibetanness, the repression of religion and language and culture and social relationships and traditions, the forced settlement of millions of Tibetan nomads, and essentially they're trying to end the nomadic way of life on the Tibetan plateau. And so for Tibetans, there has been the exile, the political movement, the support for Tibet, the leadership of His Holiness has provided some protection and some, in some ways, mitigated the way that the Chinese government has acted in Tibet for all of these years. Though the situation is terrible, there's been that light shining from outside that's made it difficult for them just to do whatever they want, I would say, in some ways, like what's happening in East Turkestan. And so now what we see, I'll just give an example of language. So in eastern Tibet, in the traditional Tibetan province of Amdo and part of Kham, which is mostly in Qinghai, the Chinese government, the provincial authorities 10 years ago tried to do this language reform policy where they were going to switch the medium of instruction for primary and middle school to Chinese. And thousands of Tibetan students across this region rose up and protested. And they challenged the authorities on this. And being so soon after 2008, the authorities did back down. They didn't want this kind of trouble or the escalation of these protests. And so with support from outside and Tibetans and students and teachers protesting inside and ex-government officials bringing forth petitions, they were able to, the authorities backed off and said, we will do this later when conditions are better. Well, now here we are, news has just come out of one area of eastern Tibet that they are planning to do this fall. They're going to change the medium of instruction. And that all of these Tibetan school children will suddenly have to learn in Chinese. And what this means, I think, it's hard to just grasp for us who've never faced such an issue, but I was just speaking with a Tibetan friend here, and she was talking about when these policies were implemented when she was a young girl in Lhasa, a school child just entering middle school. And she said she went from being the top student in math to failing. And this was the story for all of her peers and people she's met here and now. This whole generation of Tibetans, the immediate impact is that their studies were completely disrupted. Their futures were impacted because of their achievement in then high school and their ability to get into good universities or their future careers. Everything was impacted. That generation had such a hard time. Not to mention that what the Chinese government knows they're doing is taking trying to disconnect people from their own, the children from their own culture, from their parents, from their mother tongue, from their ability to achieve. And so I think, so there have been 155 self-immolations in Tibet, at least to date. These only started in 2009, really in 2012. And I have the words of one of the young Tibetan 18-year-old boy who self-immolated because of his wanting to protest China's occupation and the cultural genocide that's taking place. And I think in his words, we can understand best how this feels, the religious repression, the suppression of Tibetan identity and the language. He says, at the time, he said he did die as a result of the protest in February 2012. He said, "Raise your head high." These were his final words. "Raise your head high with courage and loyalty. I, Nangdo, call with gratitude upon my parents, siblings, and relatives. The time has come for me to leave, for the sake of the Tibetan people, by lighting my life on fire. My requests to Tibetans are, be united, be Tibetan, dress Tibetan, speak Tibetan. Never forget that you are Tibetan. Be compassionate. Respect your parents. Most of all, be united. Treat animals with compassion. Do not slaughter them. Long live His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Long live all the lamas and tulkus of the land of snow. May Tibetan people be free from China's oppressive rule. There is immense suffering under China's rule, and the suffering is unbearable." I think that's one of the most clear expressions of what this means to people, to an 18-year-old boy.
Yeah, in terms of the Chinese Communist Party's religious policy toward the Protestant and the Catholic communities, since these two communities, do not necessarily affiliated with one ethnic group, so the religious policies are always designed for absolute control, if not absolute destruction. Especially under President Xi Jinping's regime, this slogan called sinicization, which really, in essence, means pacification. I mean, 宗教中国化就是宗教法西斯化. It means basically, if the church or both personnel or doctrine, if it's not under the CCP's absolute control, then that if you don't follow the party's words or to follow the party's path called 听党话, 跟党走. So this slogan, like follow the words of the party, walk with the party, is put as posters everywhere in the churches, both the Protestant and Catholic churches. And then you're facing destruction. I mean, so under President Xi's regime, the administration, since he took power, the first experiment he had happened in Xinjiang. I mean, immediately, unprecedentedly, that even the government-sanctioned, registered, supposedly legally kind of protected churches were targeted. Within a year or so, at least over 17 to 1,800 church crosses were being demolished, destroyed, taken down. Many even churches were being totally destroyed. And after that experiment was deemed as successful, then the campaign started all over China. And for the first time since the Cultural Revolution, that the Chinese regime would force the religious believers, certainly to the Christian community, to sign a form to renounce their faith. And no children, including other professions like the medical professionals, like doctors, nurses, and teachers, educators, and anybody under 18 years old. is none of them is even allowed to have any religious identity, especially in those Christian populated areas. Children were forced to sign a form to renounce their faith. And even the CCP is trying to change your faith. Of course, the doctrine, the Communist Party's religious doctrine, or policy doctrine, is to make religion compatible with the communism and socialism. So they want to change your doctrine. I mean, we have instances showing the Xi Jinping sent religious affairs inspectors going different churches, mosques, and even Buddhist temples, trying to examine and change your doctrine. So in one instance, we already documented that religious affairs inspector would change the 10 commandments to none by removing the first commandment. And now there's a 5-year retranslation of the Bible plan to make the Bible scripture compatible with socialism. So this is an ongoing campaign, and also the culture of believers shows a very kind of destructive force in the name of national security. And you have, as Ambassador Brownback just mentioned, the early Rome Covenant Church, which is still under enormous kind of amount of persecution in the past year, or less than a year, since December 9th, when more than 300 believers were arrested in that church alone. We recently learned at least 80 of them, 80 members, from like 3 years old to 70 years old. At least 80 of them suffered torture in order to extract confession, false confession against their church leader, Pastor Wang Yi, and his wife, in order to build a case for so-called inciting the subversion of state power. And so we documented last year alone, in 2018, with all the credible information, at least over 50,000 disbelievers were being tortured and abused. So this is a really major campaign for, if not absolute control, then for absolute destruction.
Great. We only have time for one last round of questions. I wanted to ask each of you if you can offer some guidance or advice for the international community, but also for Chinese citizens. Obviously, the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese citizens. What you would like to see them, the international community, do? What actions they should take? Is there a role, or how would you mobilize that role for Chinese citizens? But I would also, I know your time is short, I think it's important for each of you, to the degree it affects your community, to talk a little bit about how dangerous or is it dangerous for those in exile, yourself, the repression, the blowback of your families and friends inside China. Are there things along those lines where your activism, your speaking out, has a ramification for your friends, family back in the country? So what should we be doing to highlight that aspect of your activism? You want to start first,
Sure. And answer both questions now?
You can take either. We only have 7 minutes.
So maybe I'll just go, right, I'll go straight to what we would hope in this moment, as we are 30 years on from Tiananmen Square massacre, and that moment that we believe is so alive with hope and possibility. Now we need to recalibrate, and it's time for the international community, and especially policymakers and opinion leaders, really to think about how we turned to China's language, and we've sort of changed all the rules to adapt to what the Chinese government wants and what they want us to say, and how important language is. And so this is just one part for us. We'll be asking the government leaders to reconsider or stop saying at every possible turn that Tibet is a part of China. Tibet is a part of China. That this undercuts the Tibetan position, the compromised position of the middle way policy that the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama came up with the Tibetan government in exile. is forwarding and that the world and world leaders support. That to say that over and over again is exactly what China wants. And it's not helpful to the position of the Tibetan government and of His Holiness to say that and to give them what they want. And the position itself should be re-examined. What should the position of the US government and governments around the world be on the status of Tibet? And to look at that in the light of international law and history. And so that is one key thing. And then I think, just furthermore, going on language, 2008, so many people describe it as journalists and policymakers, everybody, in China's terms, as a violent riot or riots. There were, in March and April alone, at the International Campaign for Tibet's numbers, 125 protests across all 3 historical provinces of Tibet. Outside, not just in what China calls Tibet, the Tibetan Autonomous Region, but in Qinghai, Gansu, Sichuan, Yunnan, the areas of Tibet have been absorbed into China. And of those 125 protests, tens of thousands of Tibetans participated in the protests. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority, were nonviolent. And the handfuls, say 14, that turned violent, the majority of them were property destruction or targeted at the Chinese state. So to call 2008 a violent riot on behalf of Tibetans is just, I think, not just factually incorrect, but it's wrong. And it does exactly the wrong thing in terms of reinforcing China's messaging and framing of the issue. And then Tibetan places. When we are talking about Tibet, Tibet exists. Tibetans have names for all of these places that even China recognizes as Tibetan. All of the Tibetan autonomous prefectures in those Chinese provinces. And to call those places by the Tibetan names, or at least to call them by both names, or put the Chinese name in brackets, or a slash, something that just doesn't hand over these important historical, geographical truths to China. It's not that's not a neutral thing to do, and the Tibet-China conflict should be more evenly treated by the international community. It shouldn't just be on China's terms, and clearly doing everything on China's terms has not gotten us where we want to be today. So this should be reconsidered in all of this. Language matters. The Chinese government knows language matters. The weaponization of history is critical to them. We're seeing that play out all over the world. It threatens all of our security. The Tibetans deserve at least this much, the reconsideration of this language.
Yeah, I want to really pay attention on another issue of, I think, really the Communist Party cared most is the internet freedom. I think why, a guy called Zhang Haitao in Xinjiang, was sentenced to 19 years old for tweeting, forwarding 274 messages through Weibo and Twitter. 19 years. I think the communist regime is very, very afraid of the freedom to connect, the information freedom, the truth that really contrary to their regimes built by lies. And the Communist Party, one leader even said that. He said, if our party cannot traverse the hurdle represented by the internet, it cannot traverse the hurdle of remaining in power for the long term. 我们党过不了互联网这一关，就过不了长期执政这一关。So this is the kind of the one particular issue. I think that the internet ability to undermine their survival, and therefore the Chinese regime provide unlimited resources to maintain internet firewalls. I mean, this is really the brain walls of our time. So unfortunately, I think our U.S. Agency for Global Media, which is the successor of the BDG, the Board of Broadcasters Agency, they have only divert less than 1% of the budget among their over $700 million each year for internet freedom. And I think that is a huge mistake. And I hope, of course, the U.S. AGM's the kind of self-interested disregard of the internet power to fulfill the 21st century mission is very inexcusable. So I would really call the BBG or USAIGM, the internet freedom anti-censorship budget to really at least to kind of increase to 10%. I think that, because technology is already ready and it is mature and it doesn't need to really increase the taxpayers' money to accomplish. So we established a coalition from both right and left, working along with the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, the Tom Lantos Human Rights and Justice Foundation. And we call on Congress really to establish a primary US AGM's obligation to rapidly provide access to the internet in closed societies, or at least to compel the US AGM to allocate, the not less than 10% of its corporation. And the world will be freer and safer the day after 200,000 Iranians are able to conduct interactive town hall meetings, and 500,000 house church Christians are able to participate in a US-based, worship services online. And the same will be true when Chinese crackdowns in Tibet and in Xinjiang can be immediately known to the world and in China. So the time has come. I think I would urge a policy, kind of a very small fine-tune that will make the difference. I remember last year when Senator Jim Lanford and I conducted an online kind of a meeting with 5 house church leaders in 5 different provinces with one available internet viable circumvention software. And without any detection, we conducted over an hour. How about expand it, to a million, 5 million, to not only the ethnic Han Chinese, but in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Iran, North Korea. So that's
great. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Today is 21st century, we all know, but more than 3 million people in the concentration camps. After Second World War, all the world have very good, very bad experience, saying never again. But it is happening again in Uzbekistan. But China, in this century, continually denied and hiding the reality, saying no, we don't have a camps. We have a training camp or vocational camp, something like that. And today, so many things was going on. Maybe so many deaths was happening in the camps, but actually, reality, a lot of evidence we don't know. So most of them continue the silence today. So many orphanages, more than 100 or 500,000 Uyghur detainees are already transferred to the Chinese province. What for reason? Was it over the capacity of the camps? This reason, or for the organ harvesting? For this 500,000 Uyghur, for the use of organ harvesting possibility? We don't know. And such a horrible things was going on. And also Chinese government not only persecuted to the Uyghurs inside the camp, inside Uzbekistan, but also and call to the Uyghur activists outside and abroad to push the silence. If you speak up, then your family member will be dangerous again. So that's why most of some Uyghur who live in United States, Germany, Europe, around the world, have the same problem today, face the same problem. So in this situation, but unfortunately, today is all over the world, more than 200 countries. But among them, very few of them, like United States, Canada, European countries, speak out. But most of them countries continue silent, particularly Muslim countries. Only Turkey speak out, and as the United Nations 40 section of Human Rights Council speak out. The rest of them, all the Muslim countries, not only silence, even support Chinese policy towards the Uyghurs, repression policy. It is a really shame, 21st century. And and today is also a lot of foreign company continue doing business with China. Even some company, United States, Germany, some other European country, also and investing and also helps provides surveillance technology. This should be stopped. And the U.S. government and some other country, democratic country, of this should be and takes a concrete action. Yes, recently most really international media attention to this cause. And the United States Vice President Pence and Pompeo, Foreign Minister, all speak out. We are very happy for this. But just the concern on the issue not good enough, because China never stopped, continue expanding, continue arrested people, denied people, killed people. So someone should say stop it. It is the time to stop. And the other things, and this year is not only 30 years anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre, but also 5th July is 10 years anniversary of the Urumqi massacre. Already 10 years passed, but we don't know exactly how many people were killed, how many people injured. Still, a couple of thousand that we were still missing. So, world should be ask the Chinese government takes the responsibility. And I would like to mention here, use this opportunity to the Chinese friends. 30 years ago, Chinese democratic movement started Beijing. All the Uyghur students support this democratic movement. Stop teaching and strike and went to the street and support the democratic movement. Today, more than 3 million people in the camp. We see very less support for the Chinese people. Of course, some Chinese democratic society outside the country speak up, but not good enough. Even some students who study in Germany, Europe, Xi Jinping visit just last month visit Europe. That time, so many Chinese students who study Europe support China's Xi Jinping, make demonstration against us and welcome Xi Jinping. Okay, is Chinese civilian in brainwashing, they cannot speak up in China, but they are enjoying democracy. Your study is the democratic country. You should not support the dictator. No? You should wake up and at least Chinese civilian people and stand up with us. This is the only way to stop this persecution.
Thank you. Well, please join me in, I guess you just did, a round of applause for our Democracy Award winners.
Hi everyone, if you can just keep your seats because they're just making the next panel we're setting up for. It'll start in 2 minutes.
No, no.
Pretty much there. They have since they get the tie up. They are pretty much, it's probably a week, but they recorded 2 months of training in co-op. So they're about there. I know, it's hard because it's right. So anyway, they'll be up there. It's not going to be much I guess the sister. It's already boxed out.
Ladies and gentlemen, could you please take your seats? So once again, thank you so much for joining us today. We are delighted to proceed with the second part of today's event, which will be looking at resisting the spread of China's repressive tactics and technologies. Before we go straight into interacting with our speakers today, I thought it was really remarkable to hear from all the speakers in the first session, perfectly illustrated the point that often comes to mind when I think about the impact of PRC technology, which is that it's easy to think of these technologies as simply a screen or a keyboard or something that is somehow divorced from the human experience. And what our three speakers this morning really brought to bear and really, I think, exemplified was the absolute humanity that is at risk here, that it is really people's lives who are affected by what we're talking about. And even when we discuss seemingly esoteric issues like technology, at heart, we're really talking about human freedom and human dignity. And that's something that I think absolutely has come through already in today's discussions. We're delighted today to feature three people who have spent a good deal of their experience thinking about these issues of the PRC's tactics and technologies and their impact on freedom. And so I'll briefly introduce them, but you will have their bios in your packet. To my direct left is Xiao Tang, who is the founder and editor of China Digital Times, based at the University of California at Berkeley. To his left is Sophie Richardson, who is the director of the China program at Human Rights Watch here in DC. And at the end, we have TT Cat, who is a Taiwan-based civic tech activist. All three of them will have distinct perspectives and I think a great deal of knowledge from part. We don't have that much time today, so I'll get right into it, and I think we'll just have a conversation about some of these issues. Xiaotan, I wanted to start with you, because we are also thinking about the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre this whole week. And I was hoping we could talk a little bit about your own perspective on this, and in particular, perhaps talk a little bit about your experience and how you've seen the discourse around Tiananmen change over the years since, both within China and maybe outside of China as well.
How can I be short on this? Almost exactly 30 years ago, I was a student in physics studying here at Notre Dame University. And the next day I saw the massacre on TV. The day after I went back to China. I myself wanted to do something for I started one very brief story. It was already 2 months later I was back to China. My family connected with my family was panicked that the fact that I came back at this time. They wanted me to stay away from Beijing as far as possible. So they sent me to on the border of China North Korean border, Chiangmai Mountain, where my father, who is a Chinese scientist, ecologist, has an observing station in that border. They want me to stay there for 2 weeks. Don't come back to Beijing. It took me a while to get to that border of observing station. And I woke up in the morning, heard loudly on the radio, somebody radio in the next door, Voice of America. These Chinese researchers and the staff workers in there, since they're away from the city and from there, including the party secretary, were listening Voice of America in such a loud way that it woke me up in the morning. And that was late July 1989. Technology does penetrate. That's the first thing. Secondly, I want to say is that we all know, yes, today, or after 30 years, that you ask many people from China, living in China, there are some of them say we don't know, somebody say we don't remember, somebody say we don't care, and somebody say actually I have changed my mind, maybe 30 years ago was the right thing to do by the Chinese government. I heard all of them. I'm sure many of you do that too. Really? Is that really true? Chinese government don't think. Look at the hundreds of words they are banning on the internet, filtering. Not like people not talking about June 4th, not talking about 8 times 8, not talking about May 35th, not talking about the word today, like now, tomorrow. If you search that, this kind of internet talk shows up on the top. Therefore, they ban that search word right now. We're not talking about fire. These are the Chinese language characters. Candle, remembrance. So don't tell me that Chinese government mistake on this. They know precisely they're still sitting on that fig. So it's not over. And technology demonstrates precisely this.
That's a terrific introduction to how we're going to be approaching things today. And Sophie, I wanted to ask you, because I know that Human Rights Watch recently published a report called China's Algorithms of Repression, which of course goes far beyond banning terms or banning search words, and I think demonstrates some of the really both old school and cutting edge ways in which the Chinese Communist Party is applying social management techniques, particularly to the Uyghur population. Could you talk a little bit about what you found in the report?
Sure. I want to start first, though, by thanking the NED for its choice of honorees this year. Bob Dolkin, we think of you as friends, but also as exemplars, as advocates, and it's an honor to work with you. Thank you for doing that. Well, to try to follow Xiao, who's a tough act, we just finished a project reverse engineering a police app, and perhaps sort of in keeping with what you just said, amazingly, we found evidence, we found references to a broad surveillance technology that was being used across the region called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. And we'd seen some chatter about it on WeChat accounts used by police in the region. But then, sort of in sort of a marvelous example of what sometimes is available and what isn't, we found the app online. It was publicly available. And we thought, really? We're a little bit surprised to find it, but we downloaded it. We spent some time debating about whether we actually wanted to try to touch the servers and sort of reach inside it, and we decided that was a bad idea. And so we enlisted the help of a group that's based in Berlin called Cure 53 to essentially do a static reverse engineering. And the truth is, we weren't really sure what this was going to tell us. We had set out to try to understand better who was being detained in Xinjiang and why. What did you have to have done in order to wind up being interrogated or being put in a political education camp? And what the reverse engineering ultimately told us was that all different kinds of behavior, I think we came up with 36 behavior types was the language that was used in the app, the vast majority of which were legal, were being used to determine whether somebody was actually considered suspicious. So some of the behavior types that the app specifically tracked, the fact that the state can know these things about you, right, that this kind of information is then gathered regularly through all different forms of surveillance, whether you were suddenly socializing less with your neighbors, if suddenly you were shy, you weren't quite sure exactly how that got determined. If you had typically gone out the back door of your house and then all of a sudden you started going out the front door of your house, that this information was aggregated through this app and fed into this overall surveillance system, which would then in turn identify to police in a particular area, you need to go and check out, Xiao's behavior because he's using a different door and we think that's suspicious. And when we were able to actually connect the use of that app to some of the cases that we profiled in our previous work about the establishment and the use of political education camps, I think we felt confident to say that there was a clear link between how this technology was being used and contributing to these larger violations. And I think what's most alarming is first that the state can gather this kind of information without you knowing about it or being able to really resist it in any particular way, but also that it, like the political education centers themselves, really has absolutely no legal basis whatsoever.
And this, just to be clear, this app was something that required, it had both a technological platform, but it also had human input.
Correct. And one of the more interesting aspects of looking at some of these WeChat discussions amongst police was that they, first of all, complained bitterly about how much work it was to input and deal with this kind of data. And at the end of the day, there's a lot of human effort required, which also creates opportunities for people to resist, which is maybe something we can talk a little bit about. But also there were complaints about how the use of this technology robbed people who had been trained to provide public security. And we're not generally terribly sympathetic to how Chinese police are feeling on a given day, but it was interesting to observe that people found it objectionable that essentially their agency as professional individuals was being taken away by this technology because it told them what to go and do in the presence of certain information. They couldn't not do that.
So we've talked a little bit about censorship and a little bit about surveillance. And TT Kat, I wanted to go to you to talk a little bit about an aspect that is linked to some of these, which is sort of the pushing out of propaganda and disinformation. As a civic tech activist and an analyst, I know you studied the ways in which the Chinese Communist Party's disinformation tactics are spreading through Taiwan's democracy, for instance. Could you maybe give a little bit of background about yourself, and then also, what are you seeing in this space?
All right, so first of all, it's my honor to speak with two great panelists today, which I really admire your work. I'm an activist, campaigner, and also a coder. Started from 2004. In Taiwan, I participate for LGBT movement, human rights movement, and democracy. So past 3 years, I worked for this civic tech community for open government through open data. We connect the tech community with the civil society organization and build a tool for civil society organization. So before we get into this issue, what happened in Taiwan, I just want to echo the previous panelists talking about identity. So the China did a lot of the things trying to eliminate Taiwan's identity from outside or within. So last year they called for 44 international airlines company to try to change the Taipei airport as a Taipei, China. So that's a huge misunderstood for a lot of foreigners who don't understand Taiwan situation. So if you want to travel to Taiwan, don't apply visa from China government. That's the notice here. Right. So actually, a lot of the people trying, especially from US, there's a global education centers come to Taiwan to want to understand how China spread their propaganda and disinformation in Taiwan, right? But very little people really understand how those channel, what kind of channel they use, and through the WeChat or Line group, because some messaging inside the Messenger app. And not like in US or other places, we don't use Twitter that often. We use Facebook, and the Facebook tend to close. After the scandal last year, they've been very close right now. So you can probably not do comprehensive analysis about all those messages, where they come from and how they spread and maybe. But this civic tech community I worked with before, they did develop this like chatbot in Line. Line is a instant messenger app, very popular in Taiwan, Thailand, and some Asia places. So they developed this chatbot. So if you get any message, you can forward to the chatbot, and then the chatbot will respond to you whether or not it's a fake news. So it's a open database like Wikipedia. Everybody can become an editor, and it's a more easy way for elder people or for the people who don't familiar with the internet. They don't know how to Google and do the fact check by themselves. They can using this chatbot. So this chatbot engaged more than 100,000 users right now. So we get a lot of messages from the chatbot, right? Then we can analyze about how often we see one single message be reported by users we engage, and also how many time this message survive within this like a different chat group. And then there's a new program is coming up to want to look at those messages from this open database and see more if we can find out where the China narrative or where their influence message align with their unified front techniques. Right.
And there seem to be a lot of similarities there between the ways that disinformation propagates through Taiwanese democracy and the ways that other authoritarian disinformation spreads through other countries. So I'll come back to that in a second, but let me turn back to you, Xiaotian, because Sophie had mentioned that in this app that they had taken apart and analyzed, there was a combination of human input and machine learning essentially, and an aggregation of databases. In a recent article that you wrote for the Journal of Democracy called President Xi's Surveillance State, you go into great detail about the ways in which, particularly with respect to surveillance, things have advanced much farther than we may have thought possible even a few years ago. And you discuss issues like face recognition, voice recognition, even DNA recognition. Could you talk a little bit about some of those trends and what are we seeing now and what do we see on the horizon?
Maybe you also remember that until 3 years ago, I still have been very passionately advocating on the side of technology, the liberation side of the communication technology, internet, the digital promise we all had, the hope we had, empowering the ordinary people, the freer flow of information, the connected, more connectivities, and emergence of a new form of collective action. That happens in China over the last decade, and I've been observing. And of course, I had great hope for that to transform the Chinese society. But the fact I observed, and the data shows in my research tells me that the Chinese authority has, since Xi Jinping stepped in power, particularly because he realized the vulnerability of the regime under this technology, he stepped up tremendously the effort of control and manipulate and the repression of the internet and public opinion. To my surprise, successful. Why? In addition to the desperation of the regime and the resource of the regime, what I also know now is from my university work with other colleagues and I understand the potential technology now has turned. It's not only empowering individual users, it's actually the new generation technology, mentioned a few, right? Particularly the artificial intelligence empowered big data analysis. And this is the data-driven surveillance capitalism now is fused with the one-party dictatorship, becoming what I call the digital totalitarian state. China is well on that road. And the things that you just mentioned, facial recognition, voice recognition, DNA collection, are actually happening in China. It's not dystopian field. It's actually happening in China. In Xinjiang, particular, it's spreading out of China more and more. China's government is really on this way. And the technology helps. The individual users have no power, but surrender their behavior data every day, every single move using WeChat. One thing. Yes. And the corporate, Chinese private corporation is not really private. And the state has full access to all these data and the potential of technology. Okay. Some of them not quite there yet, such as machine learning for social credit system. If they want it, they will get it. But the whole plan is there. And with this new technology of surveillance, maybe this authoritarian regime can really last longer than what I thought. And this really deeply concerns me. I still have the hope that ultimately people desire of freedom of prevail and technology, some of the technology will help. But right now, we're not in that phase of history. We're in the phase of the technology threatening the human existential freedom in China, as a matter of fact, throughout the world.
I mean, you and I have both looked at the issues of internet in China for a long time, and I know back in the early days, people used to talk about a cat and mouse game, but primarily talking about trying to get around censorship. And these days, it sounds as though you're saying the cat has gotten much bigger and more well equipped. And if you think about ordinary people as the ones trying to get around some of these mechanisms, it's one thing to get around censorship, it's another thing to get around an entire apparatus that is able to essentially predict your behavior or, cut off avenues of dissent even before they arise.
And induce your behavior towards what state wants to construct. And think of how many cameras right there. Think of China as a leading technology that on facial recognition and artificial intelligence. And just using one short word, I used to focus on censorship on the internet, but now the issue is censorship by internet throughout its entire space.
So you mentioned the companies that are developing some of this technology, and Sophie, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see the role of the private sector in building out some of these technologies, not just within China, but obviously coming from outside China as well. How do you then shine a spotlight on that, and how do you induce behavior on the part of the private sector that won't enable these kinds of practices?
That's a great question. Maybe I'll say a few words about our work around a company that's based in Massachusetts called Thermo Fisher Scientific. And when we started writing about the compulsory collection of biodata across Xinjiang a couple of years ago, one of the ways that a lot of us have done work to find information and evidence about what's happening in that that region has involved looking at police tenders or bids for government services that are available online. And that was how we came to understand that at a time when the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau was gathering this kind of data about people, this particular company had sold quite a large number or an unusual number of DNA sequencers to the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau. I want to be very clear that we were never able to show definitively that that company's sequencers were used in sequencing the DNA of these particular people, but it was clearly a coercive environment in which massive human rights violations were taking place. Let's recall that the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights, at a minimum, oblige companies or strongly encourage them to have a due diligence strategy in place that they have to follow to ensure that their business operations aren't enabling or contributing to serious human rights violations. So we wrote to this company and said, we see that you've made these sales to this police force. Here's what we know is going on in this region, particularly with respect to the kinds of issues that your technology could be used for. What do you say? And what's your due diligence strategy? And suffice it to say that after a couple of exchanges of letters and months went by, we still really hadn't gotten a satisfactory answer to any of the questions that we had put to this company, at which point we enlisted the support of some congressional offices, particularly Senator Rubio's office. And they then took these issues up with the company and didn't really get a terribly satisfactory reply either, at which point we enlisted the support of the New York Times, which wrote a piece that everybody should read because it's terrifying and it's blood-curdling. And it was in the face of the publication of that piece that Thermo Fisher finally said, we will no longer sell that particular technology in Xinjiang. Not a bad half step, but what else are you selling in Xinjiang? What are you selling in other parts of China? What is your due diligence strategy? To this day, and it's probably been about 2 years-ish, I have to look, since we first wrote them, we still don't have an answer to that question. And nobody should be doing business in Xinjiang right now who cannot answer that question. Because as Xia said, there aren't private interests in China. And the state permeates lots of different realms of life there and in other parts of the country. And I think it's very hard to draw a fine line and say, we're only selling for corporate purposes, or we're only selling for research purposes, or we're only selling for, this narrow commercial interest. I think companies have to answer a lot of tough questions about their operations. And then just to flip it around a little bit, the company that's most implicated in the report that we just wrote is a very large Chinese conglomerate called CETC, China Electronics Telecommunications Corporation, which owns lots of subsidiaries that are involved in different aspects of surveillance technology. It has already been the subject of some sanctions by the U.S., but there are plenty of companies from the mainland to look at. There are plenty of companies from other parts of the world that are doing business in China in this space that I think have to answer for exactly what they're doing.
Well, companies are one thing, but one of the things that was pointed out in the New York Times article was the presumption on the part of universities who are aiding in research that they simply thought that all people had full consent, essentially. They assumed that anybody that was contributing to a genetic database that would be used were consenting willfully, essentially thinking, well, of course, everyone has the same rule of law protections everywhere that we do. And I know that you also have recently engaged on the subject of what universities can do to make sure and of course, their mission is different from that of the private sector. In many cases, as part of their founding statements, they commit to not doing these sorts of things. So what have you put out recently that might get to some of these issues?
In March, we published a code of conduct for universities around the world to protect academic freedom from Chinese government pressure. And many of you will have read stories about things like Confucius Institutes or about speakers representing the Tibetan and Uyghur communities getting harassed when they give talks on campuses by other students. What we were trying to do was reinforce the idea of the universities that many of their existing codes of conduct or honor codes, are very well, or were designed to deal with things like cheating or plagiarism or tenure or sexual harassment issues like that. we have yet to find an existing university code of conduct that imagines these kinds of surveillance, harassment, self-censorship. So we were trying to make suggestions to schools about how they could resist those kinds of pressures, but we did also include language to say that schools need to be transparent and honest, and I think a lot more careful about who they're taking money from, whether it's different parts of the Chinese government or whether it is problematic Chinese companies that are looking to give money, I think, for a variety of different reasons, whether it's they want access to certain kinds of research collaborations, whether they're looking for a little reputation laundering opportunities. Universities are big businesses, and they too have obligations both as businesses, but also as defenders of academic freedom. And I think they're very bordered on this topic. For a variety of reasons, we chose not to name the schools at which we had done interviews for this project, partly because there were over 100 of them. The positive net effect is that when we published the code of conduct, a lot of university administrators, some from schools who had previously not been willing to talk to us when we were doing the research, called us and said, "Are you talking about us?" And we said, there's a lot of work for universities to do as well in making sure that they're not part of the problem.
Some of what we're talking about, it's been written about in major news outlets. We certainly have talked a lot about all this data that's coming out, and it seems as though it would be a relatively easy thing to simply get the right information out there, let that circulate, and that should counter any counter narratives and so on. But TTCat, I know you talked about in your analysis of disinformation, sometimes just fact checking isn't enough. And I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit more.
Okay, so there's a very trendy word happening in Taiwan right now. It's called information war. Information warfare. It's not new, but people starting aware that's happening right now because due to the election last year, there's a referendum, 7 million people against LGBT, and there's a lot of KMT or Poor China candidates be elected. So now people are very worried about the next election, which is the next January. So people are talking about information warfare, but actually there are some researchers, but not as many as it should be, and they are trying to find the real evidence, which is very hard. But they wanted to aware other people who still don't know there's a China influence, or they buying the media, or they buying this like a local agent to try to spread their narrative. But when they trying to telling other people, it spread the fear. And the general public or civil society organization, they don't actually have an action plan or counter activities to deal with that, or show the real evidence who is actually taking the money from China. We only have a few right now. So if you go back to see the purpose of the information warfare, what they're trying to do actually is to divide your society. They don't actually care who gets elected, actually. They want to divide your society and to tell you that, you see, democracy is a chaos and it's an inefficiency. It's not working, it's a lot of a fight, right? So they try to undermine your democracy value. So what we're trying to do is that, on the one hand, we need more technology, open technology, civic tech, for democracy and human rights, to finding the evidence, to mapping the channel, to tell the people who actually are the local agent for foreign regime. But on the other hand, we also need to develop the social innovative techniques to communicate with the people who feel unheard, who feel disconnected, who feel distrust the government. So if we only use the fact check result to talk to them, to argue their argument, they wouldn't believe your point. You're just pushing their away. So I think people from the United States are very familiar with this, and we are looking to start. We are like very way behind right now. We need to start doing this. That's one talk.
And there are many similarities there. I think it's interesting that many people think that the Chinese party state is only concerned about suppressing, essentially censoring certain topics, but what you've described is very similar to what you might see the Kremlin doing in many countries, sort of trying to sow out in democracy itself, which is an interesting wrinkle. Xiaochen, I wanted to ask you, and we'll have to wrap up pretty soon, but I wanted to get your sense on why all these issues are relevant outside of China. You know, we've talked a lot about the ways that these are developing both in Xinjiang and then outside more broadly in China, but increasingly there is, you alluded to this, sort of a worry that some of these tactics and technologies might also be present in other places, especially along countries of the Belt Road, maybe even farther afield if technologies are influenced by norms that maybe are being crafted within the UN, within other institutional settings where the CCP is able to exert influence. And so I was hoping you could just at least start that off.
Yeah, I actually want to share a conversation with a German diplomat yesterday. I was in Berlin. That surveillance technology spread out the world. Politics. She said this to me, that we know clearly, German government, we know that the nature of Chinese regime. But authoritarian regimes usually are weak. Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, China is powerful. This is a powerful authoritarian regime, now economically and geopolitically expanding in the world. So this is the issue, and this also the powerful authoritarian regime taking advantage of the open society, the democratic and diversity of the voices and democratic system and rule of law and freedom of expression to their own strategic advantage, but advance their interests, which fundamentally undermine the value of our society and eroding our society. Those technologies doesn't really stay in China because Chinese companies are expanding around the world. Because a political system that domestically oppressive will definitely becoming internationally imperial and dominating and using, look at the One Belt One Road. They're not only exploiting China's laborers and building infrastructure, buildings and ports. They're also providing digital infrastructure, 5G, surveillance technology under the name of smart city, particular component called safe city. And all these technologies are going to throughout the world. But once any country, any society, your core communication infrastructure are being under the company of the authoritarian regime like China, then you are really endangered the value, the national security of human society, that United States includes. So this is why it's so important for us to address this issue.
And it's not, as you allude to, it's not just a problem of the Chinese government exporting this technology to other like-minded regimes, for instance. There's sometimes a perception that it's just going from authoritarians to authoritarians, but you're implying this is something that democracies and societies in between, everyone has to think about and grapple with.
Yeah, and they're facing it. They are facing the issue right now.
Sophie, I was hoping that we could maybe conclude on a bit of a positive note by thinking about the ways in which civil society might be able to not simply be on the defensive, expensive, but think about how you would really make a difference in this environment. And because Human Rights Watch has had such heavy hitting reports, and you've been thinking about ways to conduct advocacy around this for a long time, what are some of the things that civil society, not just in the US, but around the world, can think about doing?
I'm not sure why this question is coming to me, since I'm not necessarily known for my optimism, but look, I think, these guys have just offered up important observations about, innovating with technology and making citizens more aware and empowered. We can go all the way through the spectrum of, things like sanctions against companies that are problematic. But let's also not lose sight of the fact, that, for example, if there is some resistance inside China to, being turned into, data entry machines, that people don't like that creates a little bit of room. People may resist doing that a little bit in ways that are, sort of think about Jim Scott, weapons of the weak, right? That people resist having to do those sorts of work. That people are finding ways to innovate around restrictions or try to live outside certain kinds of constraints. I think there's a lot of work to be done by people in our communities in explaining what the risks are. But I think once those are understood, it's not very hard to see a response. Whether that's very high octane debates about whether a country should sign on to have Huawei, or really what the risks are. I think the awareness about what the potential for abuses are gets commensurately higher, not just in whatever the other country is, but about what the realities people are grappling with inside China are. And that awareness is not a bad thing.
And PT Cat, just to finish up our conversation on technology, I was hoping you also, given your experience, and I sense that you do have a hopefulness and optimism about technology coming out of the civic tech community. What are the ways in which technology can be used to really strengthen democratic resilience in your view?
Well, when we describe this word civic tech, I've been worked with them and observed this like international civic tech network happening in past 3 or 5 years around the world. So the central of the civic tech, I would say, is open source. It's open to people. So it's like technology, but the people own the technology. So I'm really encouraged all this like a traditional democracy network, traditional civil society, reach out to those open source technologists, because inside this open source community, they do care about the internet freedom. It's like inside their DNA. So we've been facilitating this like a dialogue exchange between NGO and technology, digital security, and also activists in the risky environment. And it worked very well, and the people start to learn how to work with each other and developing the new technology and the tools for all that. So in the end, I think it's not, well, civic tech is a two-part, right? Tech and civic. So we cannot also forget the social part. We have to build in this social part inside the tech community and the tool. That's how it might work. Yeah.
Terrific.
Well, one last thought.
Mm-hmm.
What about we start a coalition, an international coalition of NGOs on things like global privacy rights, right? Let's get out there and set some international standards that we can all, point to criticize policies, but promote better ones and share around the knowledge about technology. That's something we could all do.
Sounds like a great idea. So you heard it here first from Stephanie, and I think that's a great note. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. It's a great note to end on, though, and we all should remember there's space to do plenty here. So I hope you'll join me in thanking this fantastic panel, Xiao Chang, Sophie, and Peter.